Hi, I'm V. Today I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to fix the flaking faux leather that's on my headset. And two, I'm going to create some removable panda ears. I'm working with a HyperX Cloud 2 gaming headset, and about a few months ago they started flaking. For a temporary fix, I've been wearing a leg warmer over the top of them. I know, as beautiful as this is, I'm looking for a more permanent fix now. I started by measuring the band's length and circumference. I used a Phillips head screwdriver to remove the screws from the plastic pieces that holds the headband to the earpieces. I grouped both side pieces together. Each side piece has 2 square plastic pieces, 2 small plastic pieces, and 2 screws. As you can see, on the one side it has an R marked on it, and on the other side it has the L, so you might want to mark your headsets as well. I knew that my left side had the wire jack on it, so I wasn't too worried about marking the earpieces. However, I don't know if that's consistent with all HyperX Cloud 2 headsets. If they switch it up, it might be to your advantage to mark which side goes where. Now that I've separated the headband from the earpieces, I start with wrapping the black fabric around it so I can cut it to length and width. I'm looking to add about 2 inches, 1 inch to each side of the headband where the current headband ends, and then about 2 inches when I wrap it around. This just allows enough room for you to be able to pin it together and then sew it. I want to make it easy to turn inside out once I have both sides sewn together, so that way the extra fabric gets hidden on the inside. So I add 2 pipe cleaners that can bend around the arch of the headband to create some extra space. Then I take sewing pins and I pin around the fabric around the headband. The top part of the headband is a larger distance than the underside of the headband, so the fabric is going to be smooth on the top part and then sort of wrinkled on the bottom to make up that distance. To sew, I'm going to use a strong black thread that I double over and knot on the end. To knot on the end of the thread, I wrap it around my fingers 3 times and then kind of just roll it off my fingers and then pull tightly. This creates a messy but strong knot. When I pick my needles, I make sure that I grab a needle with a very small eye. This is going to make it less likely for the fabric to tear later on in the future. And if you've seen my other videos, you know I'm going to use a needle threader to get that thread through that tiny needle eye. As I want this cover to last, I'm going to take every precaution to make sure that this seam is going to be strong. To do that, I started off by restitching the first stitch 3 times, and that starts you off strong. It's called an anchor stitch. And then I've stitched forward 2 spots and then back 1 spot and then forward 2 spots. So that way, when you are done stitching, instead of just 1 stitch going over each section, it now actually has 3 stitches over each section. And since I've doubled over my thread, now 6 threads are doing the work of 1 thread, and obviously that's going to be much stronger and much harder to rip. I end the same way that I began by adding the 3 stitches in the same spot, and then I create a finishing knot. If you've never created a finishing knot before, that's okay. They're pretty easy. You just create a small stitch on whichever side that you are going to hide the knot on, and then you pull it down until there's this tiny loop left. And then when you have this loop of thread left, you're going to take your needle and you're going to basically sew through that loop 3 times. And that's going to create this twirl effect around the loop thread. And then when you pull the remaining thread tight, it's going to create a knot really close to the fabric itself. What that does is that allows the thread to stay tight, so that way all of the stitches that you've done previously are going to stay exactly where they are. I do this twice, so that way the first knot has a backup, just to make that seam a little bit more long lasting. Now that I've finished sewing the line, it's time to turn the fabric inside out. So I pull out those pipe cleaners and I start rolling the fabric backwards, so that way when it pulls off the headband, it's going to be the right side out. Unfortunately, because the headband increases its width in the middle of the top, I was only able to do that part of the way before I had to pull the fabric off of the headband entirely onto the wire that connects the headband to the ear right now, and then just turn it inside out in that junction and then pull it back onto the headband, so that way it has the excess fabric on the inside, and now the right side, which was on the inside, is now out. I do take care to make sure that the seam is going to be on the back side of the headband, because I think that's going to be the most comfortable and look the nicest. My first plan was to just tuck in this excess fabric that I have on the edges into the little plastic ends, but once I start trying to fit everything together, I realize it's not going to fit. They made just enough space for the leather that gets tucked into that edge, but there isn't enough space to add more fabric tucked in there as well. So what I do is I take a pin and I tuck the fabric in between the current leather and the fabric that I've added, and then I do a twirl stitch around the outside. This helps the fabric stay in place. It just makes it look a little nicer. To create a twirl twirl stitch, you prep the needle like you did before, doubling over the thread, tying the knot on the end, and then you put the needle in through the inside so that way the knot is on the inside. And then you basically just twirl the needle and the thread around the edge. This creates a decorative edge as well as keeps the hem in place. Once I added that to both sides, it took some time to figure out how to put all the pieces back together inside of these little boxes. So I created this diagram to help anybody else who's struggling with this. The red is the metal of the headset because my headset's red. Obviously, the black part's the actual earpiece. The blue part is the flat black part of this. So it's the outside one, not the inside one that's curved. So it's this one, not this one. The green L-shaped pieces are the tiny little black plastic pieces that go on the inside. The orange square is the black plastic square that is attached to the metal part of the headset. The purple part is the headband and the two metal pieces that jut out from the inside of the headband. And the yellow is the wire. The blue square, which is actually the flat black square, is going to have 3 notches in it. So the largest one is for the headband, the medium one's for this metal piece, and the smallest one is for the wire. What worked best for me is that I would lay down that flat black square, and then I would take the metal part of this and slide it into the plastic sleeve that's inside the middle of the already existing headband cushion. And then I would lay the earpiece down on top of wrist cushion that I use for my mouse to help prop it up. So that way the metal of the headband and then the metal of the earpiece would lay in the right spots for the plastic. Then once you have both of those in the right spots, then you're going to adjust the middle square plastic that's attached to this piece. So that way it's in the section that it allows it in that box. And then once that's in the right place, you're going to move the wire so that way it's going out the right notch. And then you're going to add in those 2 little tiny plastic pieces last. They're flat on one side and then they're arched on the other. Since we're working on the flat side, you want to make sure that the flat side is facing down and that the L piece's little jutty point comes out towards the metal piece. Hopefully this diagram helps. Hopefully that wasn't too convoluted. Here's an actual picture of what it looks like when it's all together right before it gets screwed together. And if you have everything in place the way it's supposed to, it should just click right into place. If you're fighting it, something either moved out of place or you put in something wrong. Obviously, if you pinch the wire, that can ruin it too. So very complicated step, putting everything back together. It's way easier to take it apart. Now you're gonna put together the other side. You're gonna feel really accomplished. And now we're ready to make some ears. As always, if you want to please the Pandaverse, please like, subscribe, and click that notification button. Next week, I'll be working on a new type of hoop art that I haven't tried yet, so we will either succeed or fail together. Now the fun part, making the ears. I want this headband to be removable so that way I don't have the ears on my headband all the time. I grab some white scrap fabric and I wrap it around the headband and I cut it down to the same length and to a width for you to fold over either side and then still have it lay on top of each other. There are a bunch of different options to connect these two. I ended up going with the gentler buttons. If you have a stronger fabric, I would definitely recommend sewing on snaps instead, just because it's less likely to get tangled in your hair. Since the headband is arched, I needed to add enough buttons so that way the fabric wouldn't bubble up. So I did end up doing 6 buttons total. Now I need to fold over the edge and stitch that down and then sew the buttons through the 2 layers of fabric. It just gives it more strength. You want to be able to fold it over on the other side because that is where you're going to sew on buttonholes. You're going to want those to be just as strong as you want the buttons. I unfortunately did not take that into consideration when I cut my fabric. I ended up folding over where the buttons were at and not where the holes were. That may have been the wrong choice. I would definitely recommend that you have it wide enough to be able to fold over both sides so you know you have something that's going to last. As always, I doubled over my thread and knotted it, but instead of doing a back stitch, I ended up just doing a single stitch all the way down because I didn't really need the extra strength on the seam since I was gonna have that extra strength with each button. I proceeded to attach the buttons. So to sew a basic 4-hole button, prep the thread like normal, doubling it over, tying the knot on the end, and then you're gonna come up from the bottom of the fabric through one of the holes of the button. So that way you're hiding that knot on the underside, and then you're gonna go down through the hole that's across from that hole you just came up from. And then you're going to go over to the one that's next to it and then come up through that one. And then you're gonna go back down through the other one. And this is gonna create an X. Once you've done that 3 times, you're gonna create a finishing stitch on the bottom side. And then you're gonna repeat that for however many buttons that you need to sew on. So I did that 6 times, and then it was time to line up those buttonholes. Because this is an arch, and because the width of the headband is smaller on the ends than it is in the middle, you can't just do a straight line of buttonholes on the opposite side of these buttons because it's not going to sit tightly. The ears won't be secure either. What I did is I just wrapped it around and then put the fabric over the top of the buttons and then just took scissors to cut buttonholes where they were. One of my buttonholes ripped, so I ended up having to stitch that and sew it closed. Because this fabric has a plastic lining or base, I didn't worry too much about hemming the edges. Depending on your fabric, you may have to put a hem all the way around each side to stop the fabric from fraying. So it's time to sew up those buttonholes. You're gonna put 3 stitches on either side, and then you're going to do a twirl stitch through the middle of the opening. And what that does is it stops the fraying from the inside, and then it stops the hole from creating a larger hole. So start with the outside, make sure you're putting 3 stitches there, but then you can add more towards the middle to make the hole smaller if you've cut your hole too big. If the hole is too big, then obviously it'll be too loose, and then that will cause the same shifting problem as if you had just put them in a straight line, and we don't want that. To make the ears, you're just gonna cut the ear shape 4 times, so that way you can sew 2 sides together with 1 opening, so that way you can stuff it and then sew it onto the top. What I did, I created a rectangle, and then I folded the rectangle in half, and then I put a coaster on top of the rectangle and I traced around it, and so when it was folded in half, it created this circle. Then I sewed up on either side so I could stuff inside. Now that I've gotten that step done for both ears, because I'm gonna have the buttons on the back side, I wanna make sure the ears are somewhere along the top and not just like randomly on the headset. So I'm gonna want those ears close to the buttons and not like in the middle. If you put them in the middle, then the buttons are gonna have to go in the middle on the bottom, and you probably don't want that. I cut a slit so that way the bottom part of the ear could go into the headband, and that way I could fold the rest of that over the top of the white of the headband, and then that is going to create a base basically for your ear to sit on, and that's gonna give your ear more balance and more stability, so that way it can stand up better. So now that I've done that, I'm gonna add those pipe cleaners. I'm gonna stuff it the rest of the way and sew this hole closed. Then I'm gonna do that again to the other side. Now that I have both ears in the right spots, and they're sewed up, and they're sewed in, and they're sewed on, I put it on. So now that I have both of the ears on, and I was wobbling around in the mirror, I realized that they were kind of wobbly, and so I ended up just putting a few stitches around the edges in some key places just to make sure that they would hold it in place, so that way they wouldn't flop around. I could see that being really cute if it was like dog ears or something like that, then you might want a little bit of flop, but bear ears don't really flop around, so I really didn't want that. But once I had those stitches in, as you can see, I flop around. They stay in place. They look super cute. I love them. I think they're really great for my first try at doing this. There are some things that I would change. I would make it so this flap part, instead of coming up, was going down. If I had just thought of that when I put on the ears, I could add the whole headband turned over, so that way this flap part would face downward instead of upward right here. So I just kind of like pushed it down a little. I would have made it longer because on the edges, obviously it doesn't quite cover everything. I did want it so these little wires could stick out. Once I had them on, I realized the wire, obviously it's a wire, it bends, so I could have just had it gone down farther and just had the wire bend further down, and I think that would have been fine because it's just fabric. And then, as you remember, I said that I didn't need to hem it because the edges don't really unravel, but as you can see, it's unraveling a little. So that was wrong on my part. I should have hemmed all of the edges. It would just be unbearable if they kept unraveling. But you know, otherwise, they're super cute. They're easy to put on and off. Like, I can wear them when I want to wear them and not when I don't want to. I feel like I could cause a pandemonium with my panda ears. You know, pandemonium. Yeah. Anyway, you get the idea. Here's some final results. If you know any other panda puns, I would love to hear them. If you like this video, check out another video. I think puns are PANDAstic.